Okay, now we are in step 4. We are going to configure step 4 and step 5 together. So first we are going to do the failover fabric 2, which is this one. We have already configured the failover 1, the fabric 1, and there's nothing much to explain here because literally what we have configured in step 2 and step 3, it is going to be the similar configuration here. The only difference is the IP assignment is different. Very important thing to remember, anything for Ethernet 1 for outside and Ethernet 5 for inside, we are going to deploy them inside the context C in ASA 3. Similar way, anything for outside D, which is Ethernet 2, and inside D, Ethernet 6, we are going to deploy them in the context D in the ASA 4. It is very similar with our first concept, the failover fabric 1. Then in the context C, we are going to configure the management interface, and then we'll enable the monitor interface inside the context C and context D. We will enable the interface authentication for the OSPF, and if everything goes well, then we would be able to ping 15.25 from context C and 15.33 again from context C. Similar way from ASA4, from context D we would be able to ping 10.17, it is outside D, and 10.41, that is also outside D, which is context D. Okay, with no further ado, let's copy and paste. Okay, as you can see, we are in the ASA3, and if you notice here, both ASA3, which is this one, and ASA4 is running in multiple mode. If I say show mode, it says multiple, both ASAs. Okay, now we are going to simply copy and paste. First, I will change the host name in both ASAs. So in ASA3, and in ASA4, I'll say ASA4. Okay, so that it will not confuse us. Now I'm going to simply copy and paste. Okay, the security context has been created, and as I said before, it is only required to do in the primary unit. So in this fabric, ASA3 is the primary unit, so it is not required to do in ASA4 as well. It is only required to do in the primary unit, which is again ASA3. Now I'm going to do the failover configuration, the failover active. Now this part, if you see here, it is required in both ASAs, the primary and the secondary. So we need to do both in ASA3 and ASA4. Let's go ahead and do that. We have already explained in step 2 and step 3, so nothing to explain again in step 4. Okay, our failover configuration is done in both ASA3 primary unit and ASA4 secondary unit. Now we are going to configure the failover group only in the primary unit in the ASA3. Well, I cannot select all of them together, so I have to do one line by one line. Now I have to say which context is using which failover group. So context C is using group 1 and context D is using group 2. Again, this is only required in the primary unit. Nothing is required anymore in the secondary unit, which is ASA4. So after I finish configuring the failover groups, we need to define the interfaces inside the context, and then we can say failover. Remember, we did a mistake in configuring the fabric 1, the failover 1. We said failover first, then we had defined the interfaces inside the context C and D, so it didn't work, so we had to pause and we had to redo it. So this time we're going to avoid the mistake. We are going to define the context first and then we are going to say failover. Let's do that. The context D also has to be deployed in the ASA3, the primary unit. After that, anything for Ethernet 2 and 6 we have to deploy in ASA4, the secondary unit, inside the context D. Again, we are deploying inside the ASA3, and now we'll say failover in both ASAs. If you see, it started to replicate everything. Yep. We just have to wait for this syntax. End configuration replication from mate. That's all. Okay, let's verify. If I say show interface IP brief, all ports are up. That's good. Let's go to ASA3, the primary unit. Show. All ports are up. Okay, now we'll authenticate the interfaces. So for context C, we'll do that inside context C in ASA3. We are inside the ASA3. Okay, and then for this one we definitely have to go to the ASA4 inside the context D. Okay, and how could I verify this? I can say show run interface. If you notice, we have hashing mechanism in both outside D and inside D. We are in the primary unit ASA3. Here as well, we have the hashing mechanism in inside C and outside C, but we did not authenticate our management interface. We don't need that. So everything looks okay so far. We will now deploy the monitor interfaces. I guess I don't have to do the change to context C because I'm already in context C, if you notice here. And we are in secondary unit ASF4, and we are also inside the context D, so I can just paste that. Okay, so everything is done. So far we remember, if everything goes well, then all the monitor interfaces should be in monitored status. Let's verify that. I'm in the primary unit ASA3 inside the context C. I will say show monitor interface. It is monitored, if you noticed here, and management interface will be waiting because we have not configured in the other ASA for the monitor interface. Let's go to the ASA4. Monitored. Everything is perfect. Let's save it. And as I said before, if everything goes well, from context C, I would be able to ping the 15.25 and 15.33. Let's do that. Okay, I'm in the ASA3 inside the context C. Let's ping that. If you notice, I can ping. I can ping both IPs from context C from ASA3. Now let's go to ASA4 inside the context D. If I can ping the 10.17 and the 10.41. I can also do the pinging from ASA3 from the context D, but I will go to the context D in ASA4. Okay, everything is perfect. We can ping every IPs that we should have been pinged from these two fabrics, from Failover 1 and Failover 2. So everything up to now is perfect. We have finished our step 4 and step 5 at the same time. I'll see you in my next step.